Welcome everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we're going to talk about the wonderful world of Mill from the hero perspective. So from Awakenings to Legacies, players have been trying to snag all the cards from your hand and deck in different ways. Heroes have their way, villains have another way, and in this video we're going to focus just on the former of those two, however, as those decks and variants are the ones that I am the most familiar with. The goal of this presentation is to discuss a few different deck concepts that have surfaced in the wake of the Legacies meta, where heroes are concerned anyway. And since it seems that we may be in this meta for a little while longer, this hopefully will stay relevant for a few months at the very least. Also, my plan is to make this the first entry in a series of videos that I'll hopefully update each time a new set comes out. So since we've got Legacies now, this one will be the Legacies edition of the series, and we'll go forward from here. So, for all of you that love to mill, I really do hope that you've already watched my video, Alternate Strategies Discarding, which is going to pop up on the screen right now. And if you haven't seen it, it's going to be a huge help to go watch that before diving into this one. But if you think you already know everything about discarding and milling your opponent, then I welcome you to watch on. As for this video, it's going to cover 4 hero mill decks and discuss various strategies, statistics, special tech, other facts and stuff about them. I'm going to highlight specific strategies that the decks do try to use, and the goal is to give you sort of a fact sheet on each one of these decks. And this will hopefully help you choose a mill deck that is perhaps more suited to your playstyle. In doing so, what I'm also highlighting is that despite mill decks being discussed in this sort of uniform way, they actually have individual features worth analyzing, right? Strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to talk about that too. So I hope that as we go through this, I can do them all justice. Also, I figured that with Worlds coming up, this could be a pretty good resource for those out there who are looking to see what works in the current meta we have. And all these decks do work, and I've won with all of them against some high-level decks, so it is possible. Anything's possible. Never forget that. Alrighty, so we're going to be back after word from our sponsor, which is actually just me and those patrons. Thanks. I love you guys. Alright, as we move to this video, you're going to be seeing the decks go from being Riken focused to more Yoda focused. So it's appropriate that we start off with this particular deck, which has actually both of those characters in it, in the same exact deck. And keep in mind that all the deck lists that you're going to see here today are all of my personal deck lists. I've tested and played them many times, dozens of times in many cases. So I know that they work in my local meta and on TTS to a pretty good extent. And a lot of these decks do share a lot in common with the most competitive versions of these decks, and in most cases are almost exactly the same with maybe 2 to 4 different cards or so. So the first one we're going to talk about is the standard Riken Yoda Partisan deck, and it's 30 points, so there's really no room for a plot here. And what this deck generally wants to run as a battlefield is war-torn streets. And the premise of this is twofold, and it's exactly the same reason that a few of these other decks run Jedha also. Firstly, the character setup and event suite typically run in this deck can mill the opponent's deck easily enough that the only challenge is getting the last few cards out of the hand near the end of the game. So if you've already watched the previous video that I mentioned in the intro, you know that your turns will speed up as you lose characters over the course of the game, thus improving your chances to claim. One thing to note is also that this deck can actually run Jar Jar in place of the Jedha Partisan, making it 29 points. So you could actually run the espionage plot if you really wanted to. But I would recommend against it in this particular deck for the reasoning that there are 3 one-ofs in the deck that would suck to lose to this plot randomly. So the first statistic I want to talk about actually is the roll-off average. And the roll-off average in this deck is just a little bit over 3, with the ceiling actually being 6, and that's pretty bad for a 3-character setup. The ceiling is normal, but the EV is pretty bad in the ROA. Typically, also, what we should also talk about is mulligan targets, and we're going to be talking about these in every single section as well. And typically in this deck, you're going to want to be looking for shield-generating cards that are first-round playable and some removal, as this deck typically wants to build a board state and reach some kind of homeostasis against aggro decks. So it's looking to bolster its defense while doing its thing, okay? So what it also really likes is a lot of the shield cards, right, which I've mentioned. As there's a good amount of them on the list here. We've got Entrenched, we've got Air Superiority, we've got Hunker Down, we've got Protective Mentor to kind of keep our shields relevant throughout the game, etc. So since the first turn potential in this deck is 4, and half of that is General Recon, the mulligan really becomes dependent on keeping him online. And that's not to say that there isn't some deviation from this as you go throughout the game. But since you know that you're likely going to be losing the roll-off against most of the 4-dice 2-character decks, you're going to be playing defensively most of the game, maybe even all of the game, okay? So cards like Air Superiority, Hunker Down, Easy Pickings, these are all clutch for this deck. But Scrap Heap and Entrenched aren't also bad pickups either if you think you're going to find yourself needing money early, or you think you're going to be in some pretty trouble early against those big-hitting aggro decks. Special Tech is another thing we're going to talk about in all these decks, and where that's concerned, this deck actually has a decent amount of outs, and its strongest cards in terms of outs are Fallback, which is on this list twice, as well as Hyperspace Jump, and those are pretty staple cards in any of these decks that have red and yellow in terms of the mill. They're very, very crucial. Something like All Quiet in the Front is actually a really fun card to play, and it's really there for the mirror match when you're playing against other mill decks in general. You know, you're probably going to be sitting there with 6+ shields, you know, if you've decided to actually play shields just to keep Recon online, and you've gone overboard, you can use All Quiet in the Front at some point as a 1-of in the deck just to kind of push over the top. And this was a deck that was very popular right when Legacies came out. People saw this deck as, it used to be played as Recon Padme with the Jedi Instructor, and it got swapped around a little bit for Yoda and the Partisan. It became a bit more cheaper to mill in terms of the deck, and also a little bit more powerful with Yoda's consistency. So let's go over and talk about the actual strengths of this deck, okay? Now, first of all, if you're looking at this list, you're seeing a lot of different cards. You're seeing money cards, you're seeing survival cards, you're seeing shield cards, and you're saying to yourself, wow, this deck actually is pretty well-rounded. And it's true. It actually is well-rounded. It has a ton of survivability with things like Protective Mentor and all those shields. It's got Sustain. And the Sustain here is basically maxed out. Also, the deck starts with 29 hit points, which is very impressive for a 3-wide deck, especially if you're talking mill, especially if you're talking about all the extra shields you're going to be putting on your opponents. Secondly, the deck also mills the opponent's deck very, very quickly. With a max of 4 to start, just among your characters, you can probably expect that estimated mill to be about 2, maybe 3 per round, not including whatever they're going to be discarding from their hand or playing on the table. You have to keep in mind, putting cards in a table, upgrades and stuff, counts as a card that you don't have to mill out of their hand, but you have to deal with in some other way. And so that 2 to 3 per round is pretty strong, and it forces games to run about 5 or 6 rounds in some cases, depending on how well your sustain works out over time. That's due to your card draws, your turn sequencing, how you manage your resources, etc. But generally speaking, you have X amount of resources, you got X cards in your hand, the deck pretty much plays itself. And that's not to say that it's an easy deck or it doesn't have it's not difficult to master or anything like that. But the learning curve on this deck actually is pretty low. You could hand this deck to somebody and it can be you can play it very defensively, very reactionary, and that's it. They draw cards, you play them in a logical order, activate your characters in a logical order, and you're going to make progress. You're actually going to take out probably 20 cards in a game if you're just starting out and you really have no idea how to maximize it. It's learning, it's increasing your learning curve in the deck. That's going to let you get closer and closer to the win con with it to get to that 27, 28 cards where you're getting those near victories until you finally push it over the top. And a lot of times, you know, that has to do more with card draw and turn sequencing perfection than really anything else. Also, your opponent rolling bad can be a great thing, right? As for weaknesses, it has its fair share of those as well. The first one worth mentioning, again, which I've said a few times already, is a turn sequencing problem that this deck can often find itself in due to General Recon himself. And this has a lot to do with the shield generating capacity of the deck and the strong desire that most players of this deck face when trying to maximize his ability. You know, I've seen a lot of players out there who aren't content with activating Recon if he's the only one, if he's only going to mill 1 card off the deck. So they get caught up in this loop of trying to keep shields up on every single character and then telegraphing their turn. And that's actually the biggest weakness here. It's the telegraphing. And it's a problem for every single Riken deck, and Hero Mill decks running him right now in general. The second and most glaring weakness is observable in the deck's endgame, and it's its inability to discard cards from the hand without C3PO or without any consistency. Now, to remedy this, two of the characters do have a single 1 discard side on their die. Problem is that's a 1 in 6, or flipping into it with Yoda, which is effectively having your discard for this turn if you're giving up his die to make the Jetta's die discard. So remember that even if the opponent removes your discard die, that actually is still a discard. The thing is, it's very rarely going to happen. So you're going to need that, to hyperspace jump at some point during your game into War-Torn Streets, most likely, if you are not playing on it from the start, to make that happen more effectively. And then you're going to have to use your second hyperspace jump to hopefully end the game. Among mill decks that we're going to discuss in this video, this is probably the second most expensive deck, only because the next one actually uses Elite Yoda. So if cost is a factor to building a deck, keep that in mind. One Yoda right now is going for anywhere between 40 and 50 bucks. It's not too bad because the rest of the deck is generally common cards. There's a few uncommons. There's generally a bunch of commons, so it's pretty cheap. Before Yoda came around, though, by comparison, this deck was about 15 bucks to build, with Padme, Riken, and the Jedi Instructor. So it basically tripled in price more or less because of one character. So if that's a consideration, it's good something for you to know. The next deck is actually my current personal favorite, and it's E-Riken, E-Yoda. And this is a sneaky one on that particular playstyle starts to build up with the combination of the battlefield and the plot, which let me get in here really quick for you. And that's Fortify and using Imperial Palace. And the Fortify plot puts Riken online immediately at the beginning of the game by giving Yoda a shield. So that's pretty clutch. And in my personal build, I like to use the Imperial Palace battlefield because of the control element that it actually brings to the game. As a disclaimer, you could also use War-Torn Streets here again if you prefer, until you perhaps become more comfortable with the pacing that this deck can provide. And there's going to be some details on the pacing as we get to the strength and weaknesses section. So next is the roll-off average. If you thought the roll-off average was bad in the last deck, well, this one's not too much better, but it does hit pretty near to 4. So the ceiling here is also 8, which is pretty good. But you're very unlikely to hit that ceiling, however. The precise odds being 1 in 324, or a 0.31% chance of that actually happening. In other words, it's never going to happen. So anytime you see the ceiling of 8 in this video, which is going to happen from now on, that's basically the percentage of it ever happening. So don't rely on it. The mulligan targets here are interesting in this deck as well. C3PO is always good to have on the table early in this deck. And most of the ones like it, including the last deck as well. If you don't need shields early, you can convert those with C3PO as you can with any of Yoda's unneeded sides, if you really think he's got an unneeded side. He's also a really great removal distraction for your opponent so that you can resolve shields as needed, as well as Yoda specials, which will be flipping things like Force Meditations and another good, really good mulligan target into specials, or flipping Riken's dice into shields or extra resources. Really, any of the supports in this list are good in the opening hand, so much so that I've actually run variants of this deck with 2 of each of them in there at different times. So 2 Spinets, 2 Your Eyes Can Deceive You specifically. I generally use a scrap heap. Sometimes I don't use a scrap heap and I think about adding another event in there, like another Entrenched, or swapping out something like the scrap heap and another card to add in 2 Spirits of Rebellion. So there's a couple different things you can do. The Spirit of Rebellion is good stuff to have against like the OTK decks so that you can instantly produce a shield and prevent the power action. Chance Cube, it's also a really good target here as well, and Scout to pressure their hand early a bit. Strike Briefing, any of the removal cards are good to have in the opening hand too. So there's actually a lot of variety and a lot of flex in this deck, so much so that there's like almost too many options in a sense. The deck also has some really great special tech. So the supports, the Your Eyes Can Deceive You and Spynet stuff, it's a great combination of cards, as I already mentioned. General Riken can really get a lot of mileage out of those supports, okay? And something like Mind Trick is also a really good card for this deck for really confounding your opponent, like against those vehicles decks. Because remember, this doesn't have a lot of hit points. So if you're playing against a Dice Flood deck, Mind Trick is absolutely amazing. As long as you've got Yoda there spot, it's really, really good. The trick, of course, is knowing when and how to play it right. And I think that just comes with practice, recognizing patterns, things like that. You don't see it on this list, but you can also run a more speedy build of this particular deck with 4 speeds, defensive positions, and retreats. It's flexible in that way, so if you want to build it that way, you absolutely can. I think that's more of that's a bit of a less competitive variant, belongs more in casual play, but it's flexible to that kind of degree where you really can play this deck as a sort of a slow deck, medium pace deck, or a really fast deck. As for this build, Determination is a great special tech card. It comes in very clutch when you need to force a hand discard. So for every 2 focus side out there can become a 2 discard, just because Determination lets you resolve a die on the table as any other side, as long as you have a die showing focus in your pool. So that can be the focus die itself. Strike Briefings, again, they let you dig into an opponent's deck to find threats that are going to be played next round. So that's also very, very important to the overall survivability of this deck, and I would consider that almost like a control piece in this deck, even though it's also a mill card. As for strengths, well, the deck makes cash money, okay? So between the cubes and all the focus options in this deck, it can produce a healthy amount of additional resources, giving you the flexibility that I spoke of before to build it in a lot of different ways. I never find myself out of money in this deck or really teetering on the brink of, oh, I'm not going to be able to play this and this. Once it gets going, it pretty much goes. Also, the deck has a really good a good mix of deck and hand pressure, depending on your board state and your hand, of course. And I really like how both of the characters are threats, even with only a decent mulligan and average draws throughout the game. So it's almost like it's consistent in that sense, like a consistent sort of mill deck. It keeps things going. Overall, I think the greatest strength of this deck is the flexibility of the character combination. Even though this is just one deck variant that I run, there's several that I've been through and several that you can try out with different play styles. If you want to know what those are, you can contact me or maybe talk to somebody who in your local who's played this deck in a bunch of different ways, because chances are they've tried it in a very speedy kind of way. And, you know, it works that way as well. As for weaknesses, well, you know what? 21 hit points, not that impressive. 22 if you count the guaranteed shield from Fortify. You know, you're squishy. But remember that you also produce shields, so in a good match, it's still going to take your opponent probably another 7 to 10 additional damage to kill you off between Yoda specials giving shields, having 2 Recon dice in the field. And while 21 is low in general, there's a lot of aggro decks out there that aren't running much more than that. I mean, when you're looking at your Qui-Gon decks, that's 21 hit points. Looking at your Boba Phasma, that's 21 hit points. But this deck is way more defensive. So even though the HP seems like a weakness, it's not the worst thing. It's not the worst amount of hit points to have. The removal options in this deck, they're very, very strong, but they're not necessarily the most efficient or optimal. There's no Into the Garbage Chute on this list, for example, because you can't really afford to lose a character for 2 rounds or in a round. You really, really can't. Also, obviously, there's no yellow, so there's no easy pickings. So you do what you can in blue. But mind you, Mind Trick, Create Dragon Howl, and Overconfidence, these are all spot blue. So that can be a problem if someone nails Yoda really, really early in the game. In fact, it can be devastating. Furthermore, if you decide to play Retreat, you got to keep in mind that it's no hyperspace jump, okay? And without that, there's no way to switch to Battlefield unless you tech in new orders. So it will save you. Retreat will save you, but for how long, right? A mill deck with the inability to swap battlefields means you take theirs and deal its ability. You have to end up taking theirs and deal with its ability all game. Or maybe they take yours and you have to decide how often you're going to leave dice on the table to snag the battlefield for the 1 discard if you're running either Imperial Palace or War-Torn Streets. So you might even suffer from that if you find a deck that plays significantly faster than yours. So kind of a problem. Again, I have tried new orders in the deck. I don't like it for some reason. I like Retreat less, and I don't know why. In terms of the turn sequencing, this deck never feels right to play Retreat for some reason. And lastly, because I mentioned it in the last deck, this one runs Elite Yoda. So for those playing the physical product, you're already looking at upwards of $90 or so just for the Yoda dice. And from there, the deck's likely going to be over $100. You know, the rest is commons, dirt cheap rares, and that one Force illusion in here. It's probably going to set you back between $5 and $7 unless you have a good buddy who's willing to give you a discount, or a store that's just clueless about prices on uncommons, which does happen. And that pretty much wraps up this deck right here. There's a lot to be said about it. It has done well competitively. It's super flexible, and it's really, again, it's my personal favorite. I keep this one in my deck box all the time because it just rocks. The next deck that I want to present is actually E-Yoda Partisan. Also, I want to give Jar Jar some honorable mention on this one too, as he's a viable substitute for one of the Partisans as usual. So, like so many other decks, it actually ends up running War-Torn Streets as well for its battlefield. And Espionage is the only selectable plot with a 29-point character deck right now. And it's actually worth it in this deck. You're not worried about losing Maz's Goggles or Entangle as the only one-ups in this deck too much. So you're also going to want to mulligan for those generally too. So while it's good, Espionage is good for starting the mill, it's not too bad to lose Goggles or Entangle if you don't get them in your opening hand. It's not that game breaking. So I feel like after playing this deck a whole bunch, you can play Espionage in this deck pretty quote unquote safely, if you want to consider it like that. The ROA in this deck, again, is an estimated value of about 4 with a ceiling of 8. And, that's okay for a 3-character deck. It's better than 3, okay? And you can pretty much expect to roll between a 3 and a 4 all the time anyway. But you're going to have 4 dice here, right? So you may be able to pull off a win against some other 4-dice decks just because of the way things happen. Still, overall, you're likely to lose, which is okay since you want shields anyway. And you're going to be playing fairly slowly with this deck, okay? As for mulligan targets, what I mentioned earlier is you may want to fish for a single pair of Maz's Goggles. That will help preserve some of your dice throughout the game by controlling their events. If you're up against heavy aggro, you may also want to consider resource pieces such as double dealing, scrap heap, chance cube. Second chance is never a bad thing to have in your opening hand if you're staring down a big aggro deck. Losing a partisan early, well, that can really suck, and it's going to definitely slow you down. So you may want to have the second chance ready to deal with that. In many games, players are going to shoot for the one that you're going to put Force Meditation on if you mulligan for that. So keep that in mind when determining where to play your upgrades and also for your turn sequencing. Into the Garbage Chute, probably the best card you can actually mulligan for in this deck, right up there with Goggles. But Into the Garbage Chute, again, for removal, is super great, right? It's never a bad card in your opening hand. Again, neither is Force Removal or any of the free removal that you're running in this deck, like Hidden Motive or Caution even can be looked at as a removal card. Great Dragon Howl is a little better early in the game to get mill out, a little better later in the game to actually remove a die. Not a really good card to keep in your mulligan. In fact, the only card I would definitely put back in the deck actually is the Bestman Wing Guard, as you really don't want that early game or even mid game. You kind of want it late game. You want to see a Bestman Wing Guard, maybe round 3, something like that, or if you can draw into it, dump your hand to go and find it, because you got to transition your game at some point from just like every other one of these mill decks, from hitting the deck to hitting the hand. And Bestman Wing Guard, with all the resources you're going to be banking over the course of the game with this, is going to be clutch in that sort of late mid game to total late game. Strength and Weakness is another borderline card that I don't know if I would keep, but I know if I've got amazing resource generation in my hand, like if I draw a Chance Cube and I draw a double dealing and I'm just stuck with that and I pull a Strength and Weakness, I'm really happy to see that, because I know I'm going to be able to not only mill out what I want to mill out with Yoda, but hey, I might actually be able to play the Strength and Weakness. And if you can get Yoda to mill 1 card and the Partisans to mill 2 with just one of them resolving indirect damage, and you Strength and Weakness, well, you just milled 7 cards, plus whatever upgrade they played on the table, plus whatever else they decided to discard to reroll if they did that, right? Plus whatever the other Jedha Partisan rolled, or the other Yoda dice rolled, if you roll discard or if you focus into discard and indirect. Good stuff here. You've got a lot of potential to get for a lot of cards really, really fast in this particular deck. As for special tech, I would say there's not a lot of special stuff in this deck. In fact, everything here is pretty transparent. And so your strategy isn't going to be a mystery to anyone. I probably don't need to tell you about the Jedi Robes Force Meditation combo being a pretty good overwrite, but it really does depend on how badly you want that focus die from the Jedi Robes to stay on the table. It's also possible to run Determination in this deck for more hand discard, by the way, although I've never felt I personally needed it late game between things like the Dice and the Bespin Wingard and Yoda's Focus. Force Med also has a focus on its die, so even if it seems like a dead card, it's actually not a completely dead card. It also has a shield on it. One of the cooler things about this character pairing is also the potential to play it in Trilogies format, right? So this deck list would need to be modified significantly for that, but it isn't actually that far out of reach. A little tweaking here and there, and you can have a pretty good, maybe even strong mill deck in Trilogies. I've seen this deck a little bit in Trilogies. I think it might actually be pretty good based on the fact that you won't have to deal with as much damage or more indirect damage, which this deck would love to deal with. In fact, all of the major milling components in this deck, if you look at it, are actually from the Legacy set, right? With the exception, of course, of Hyperspace, which is really the one special tech card you're going to see over and over again in these decks. So the package is there, right? So when you think about Force Meditation, that's from Legacies. Bespin Wingard is from the Legacies block, right? Scrap Heaps giving you money from the Legacies block. The removal, the good stuff here, Easy Pickings, Entangle, Hidden Motive, all Legacies block, right? Into the Garbage Chute, Legacies block. Strength to Weakness, Legacies block. So again, transitioning this deck into Trilogies and keeping sort of like maybe, you know, a 12 different cards in your deck allows you to swap between it really, really fast. And in the Legacies version, you would be playing Imperial Palace, which is the only current discard related type battlefield. You might also consider, I think it's Launch Deck, or that battlefield that lets you resolve die, turn it into indirect. If you didn't manage to turn a Jedha's die, you might be able to get rid of a Yoda Disrupt or a Yoda Shield and recycle it into a Disrupt with that particular battlefield and then get the mill off a Jedha. So that's another possibility there. Yep, so Trilogies variant. Sorry, I didn't click that one in enough. For strengths, probably the greatest strength of this deck is that it runs 2 yellow characters, okay? So that really allows the whole spot yellow thing to be preserved a great deal throughout the game. And that's not something that really should be downplayed, okay? This allows you actually to use the partisans as a decent like, I don't know how to say it, decoy, I guess, to Yoda, okay? And that's going to free him up to do other things as you please. The cards for this deck, with the exception of probably Yoda, pretty much, you know, are all out there and easy to get. It's pretty easy to throw together in a short amount of time. As I said already, this deck has a number of variants. They're all challenging to play with and to play against. This deck does not have the lowest learning curve out there. It's probably middle to high, but it also has the potential to spring into Trilogies, right? Like we already talked about. And it could be a really good starting point for people who are want to play in that format to try it out. If you can get 2 Yodas, I know that sounds tough in terms of the physical product, but if you want to try it out in TTS, it's pretty good, all right? Familiarity with the characters over the course of time is what's going to give you the advantage also to move from this deck as a standard build to this deck as a Trilogies build, okay? The third strength, and probably the most pronounced, the one you most care about, is that the deck mills ridiculously fast. Either partisan procs both of them, allowing for 2 mill between them. Yoda can potentially mill 2 for himself. A Force Meditation can mill another 2. If you can somehow make 3 resources after playing Force Meditation and play a Strength 2 weakness, you can potentially mill out 10 cards in round 1. And I've done this before. And with the 5 cards that they started the game with, you're talking about taking a 25 card deck that they had left to a 15 card deck and the 5 in their hand. So you've gotten rid of half of their active cards, but 1/3 of their entire deck, okay? I have more often pulled out 8 in a round 1, and that has happened with some regularity with a good mulligan. So it's definitely possible, and I think this deck is probably the most fun of them all to play. Also, it hits the hand very consistently throughout the game in place of deck mill. So it's a swing deck in that sense, right? The perfect rolls often involve one partisan rolling indirect, so you can get that, and the other one rolling discard. So if that's not mitigated, you're talking about 3 cards milled right there. Naturally, you're going to want to prioritize discard where you can, if necessary, but to take what you can get here, and you try to claim to get initiative perhaps for the next round so that you have a little more leeway to do things. It also makes resources very well, which gives you the flexibility to play as you want if you build the board state properly and if you get really, really good draws. But of course, like any deck, it does have weaknesses, and the most glaring one here is survivability. The survivability in this deck sucks. This is not Riken Yoda Partisan. It's not Riken Yoda, not by a long shot. Losing red means losing sustain, okay? And a lot of people who don't understand what red brings to mill, it brings a crap load of survivability. So this deck is really viewed better as the glass cannon of mill decks, if I can be completely honest. Jedi Robes are good and all, but they're not entrenched, okay? And entrenched is amazing for survival. When you compare the two, Jedi Robes is going to get you 2 in the first round or 1 the rest of the game. Entrenched is going to give you, just for 1 more resource than Robes, it's not going to give you a die, but it's going to give you 5 shields, 5 hit points to spread out over your characters, right? And all the money in the world is useless if you're not alive to spend it. If you're not alive to spend it. So, in fact, the way that many of these games end for me is kind of on the edge of my seat. I've actually considered adding stuff like Heightened Awareness in place of Jedi Robes or some other cards. I never really pulled the trigger on that, but I've also never taken this deck to a big tournament or run it against OTK. I've never played this deck against OTK. I'm sure that it would be very, very challenging. The other thing about this deck is that there's actually too many deck choices and not enough deck space. And I hate this problem, but I also love this problem. You look at this deck and you're like, could this deck run more removal? Yes. Could it run more sustain? Yes, but not too much more. Could it be a contender if built right and played by the right player? Definitely. But you will need to get your reps in against the top decks to understand how to craft it better for your playstyle and against the meta that might be hitting the bigger scene. So when you get to Worlds, I don't know that this deck list cuts it as is, but it might be pretty close. Matchups are also really dependent on what you get in the Swiss. So if you play a bunch of Sabine decks, you're not going to win. But if you're playing against, Boba Phasma, something like that, this deck can do okay, as long as Yoda doesn't get blown away really early. Which brings me to the last weakness here, because I want to mention how much this deck relies on Yoda. And if you're not going to play this deck and you're playing against it, this is what you need to know. Yoda. He needs to make money. He has to help mill. He also has to flip dice, and he needs to make shields occasionally. That special on his die is super important. He is the crux of this deck in a lot of ways. Thankfully, the 2 partisans provide some threats and distraction from Yoda, but as there's not a lot of survivability outside of him in this deck, if he's targeted first and dies before you can do anything in round 2 of significance, this deck is more or less dead in the water. It's still possible to win, but Create Dragon Howl is now offline, so there's no mill out of that. And the extra money that you need to play Strength New Weakness may not be there, as usually double dealing is turned off if you haven't played Force Med. And if you haven't played Force Meditation before Yoda dies, you're screwed, because to play it requires a spot blue character. So consider all the ways that standard decks can burn down a 10 health character before you decide to take this to Worlds, because you could be really good at this deck and you could just get god rolled in round 1 and the game's pretty much over. And that's obviously never a good feeling. Alrighty, last but not least, we're going to talk about the deck that hits the hardest out of all the decks in terms of what you can actually mill in a round, and that's E-Yoda, E-Padme. And let me throw the deck list up here, and this is a deck list I've been messing around for a little bit. Haven't played anything competitive with it, but in casual, it does pretty well against aggro decks. The battlefield here is War-Torn Streets, and the plot is Profitable Connections. And that fills in a 3-point character point cap to give you the additional resource in round 1, which can change your early sequencing significantly. It lets you afford an early Force Meditation and a double dealing on the same round, or a Scrap Heap or a Bespin Wingard in the same round. So all of that is good stuff. Having 3 resources, playing a double dealing, a Scrap Heap, and a Bespin Wingard, you are going to be able to Roll in Padme, probably roll a special, gain $1. Resolve her special, gain $1. Scrap heap, gain the $1 back. Use it for Bespin Wingard to mill another card, right? So with one die and those 3 supports, you can do some massive deck damage, right? And hand damage together. But, of course, it does come at a big price. So the estimated value on the roll-off here, the roll-off average, is 3. It's actually 2.999. It's so bad, okay? The ceiling, of course, is 8. But again, you're talking about a super ridiculously low chance to hit that. So chances are you're going to lose the roll-off again, which gives some credence to actually not taking Imperial Palace in this deck and using War-Torn Streets. You know, again, those are kind of... I almost look at those as a person who plays a lot of mill, I guess seasoned mill player, if you want to say. I kind of look at those 2 battlefields as interchangeable depending on how well I know the deck, how good I am with this deck, how much I know the pacing, the turn sequencing, etc. of this deck. As far as mulligan targets, an early Jedi Robes and a Force Meditation are a really good pair to have in your hand, to being able to shield up early and then override for additional mill in the same turn. Getting a Moneymaker out early is pretty good as well. So double dealing, Bespin Wingard, those things are absolutely great to have. Keep in mind, both of these characters can mill, and they have 2 special sides in their die. So those resource generators are going to be good no matter who you decide to roll out. Gives you a little bit of flexibility in your turn sequencing. The additional money can be used to fuel Padme's mill or extra removal options. So the great thing about it is this deck can actually tap out and recover its resources all in one swift action with the right board state. Playing aggressively, of course, has its perks, and I feel like it's usually the best way to play this deck against people who are inexperienced against playing mill. And if you're staring down an incredibly aggressive deck, however, you may want to consider picking up a Force Heal or a Lone Operative in your mulligan instead of some of these resource generating cards, although it becomes a bit tougher to figure out the mulligan there, right? The thing is, you got to remember that this deck only has 20 hit points, and you'll probably start out with shields, but that's not guaranteed. So be cautious against those big decks that can pump out 10 plus damage in a round, because they are really going to mess with how you think about your mulligan. It's not easy, despite having all these options. Having too many options is bad when you're playing a very, very focused deck. As for special tech, well, this particular deck is looking to special chain for heals or for mill or both. As a result, it does have sustain, and it can do them both at the same time. It can move along its win con and also slow an aggro decks down. So it has those options. And it has cheap and efficient removal. Healing cards, second chance, all to make that stuff happen. So you can consider all that sort of special tech in this particular deck. Although all special tech in a mill deck is really just about how much can I slow down aggro, right? Also, I mentioned before, either character can finish the game with mill or discard as well. And so there becomes somewhat of a targeting issue, the way that this particular deck is constructed and built. And we're going to talk about that again in a moment or two. As for strengths, well, the deck makes a ton of money, right? That's one thing, right? There's actually enough money in this deck that you could consider running Entangle in place of a second strength through weakness, or even the R2D2 if you really, really wanted to, because it could afford to do that. Targeting issues, right? Which we talked about before. There is a huge targeting conundrum when you consider how this deck is constructed and what these characters can do, right? So to break it down, Padme can mill for 1 to 4 cards per round, depending on how much money you're willing to invest. And she's the yellow character, so she lets easy pickings happen. She lets Maz's Goggles be played. She's the target for second chance. Yoda, on the other hand, he can mill 1 to 2 cards per round, flip dice, create money, generate shields, and brings the spot blue for overconfidence and also for Crate Dragon Howl. So the choice of who to kill first isn't easy necessarily against this deck at all. And opponents playing things like mid-range decks or lower tier aggro decks may be out of cards before they've even ramped up properly, because this deck is very, very explosive when it comes to mill. And that's just it, right? The deck has a lot of tools at its disposal to further its win con, to sustain, And to be able to get out of situations, because it doesn't have to worry about protecting 3 characters, but it absolutely can focus on worrying about just these 2 characters, which your opponent may not be sure which one to kill first. And that can be to your advantage hugely. As for weaknesses, keep in mind that while it can make a lot of money, it also needs it to be effective. So without the proper board state and sequencing, this deck actually mills very minimally. This also means that the deck has a relatively high learning curve to play well, and its limited health and color scheme with not having red, okay, can really be a detriment to winning with this deck consistently. You got to remember, again, no red, so we're working with a deck that has to be able to absorb some damage, mitigate some dice, and also be able to heal that damage off with some consistency. So sequencing becomes so important in this deck. It is very, very susceptible also to a quick death without the right mulligan and without the right protection and without the right removal in your hand. Both of these characters only have 10 hit points. And while that seems pretty good nowadays, it used to seem pretty good back in the day. It's pretty average now. We have characters with 11 and 12, and that extra 2 means a heck of a lot. When you're only talking about 2 characters with 10, that's really, really, really rough. Alrighty then, well, we're done for now. And so as I said recently and in another video somewhere on my channel, I actually plan to make this a recurring segment where, maybe before major tournaments, I can make some fact sheets on the various mill decks that are considered competitive, or that perhaps I've found are competitive in the right meta. So this was the Legacies edition of that, and I plan to make more videos like this one going forward as we get new sets. I also recognize that I didn't cover the Yoda Rose Partisan deck, and I'm going to tell you about that. Because, well, I actually did. It just didn't make the final cut for the video because, quite frankly, I feel like I didn't have enough reps with it whatsoever. So I wasn't really comfortable with talking about it from like an expert point of view or something. I do recognize that it is actually quite good in trilogies, but I haven't played it but twice on TTS. And that was the standard version, which I didn't think was too crazy compared to some of the decks I talked about today. There is a player named Quentin in my local store who was considering taking that deck to the GQ somewhere this weekend, I think. And he was asking about some swaps in the deck after I played him again, with it, or he was playing against me. I gave him the best advice that I could from my limited knowledge of the format. And I just kind of wished him luck, So I'm like, gee, I hope he did well. I don't know. Secondly, I also recognize that I didn't cover any villain decks here, and it's for the same reason that I just stated. I only played the Newt Jabba Night Sister deck a tiny little bit, and it was right when Legacies hit, so I'm not really comfortable presenting that to you in any kind of way. But also, Villain Mill, it isn't in a good place right now, and I think a lot of that's because yellow villain removal cards, they're just bad compared to the yellow hero cards this particular set in this meta right now, so who knows? Next set comes out, that might change. There's always new mill or discard capable characters coming into the meta with every expansion. And so I'm absolutely looking forward to seeing what we get in the way of the Force. In any case, I do hope that you liked this video and that it made some sense in terms of putting it in sequence with the previous mill related video. As for the rest of the week, I've got that edit on the turn sequencing video coming at you soon. It is nearing completion and it needs a little extra polish. So give me a few more days to work on that, and I'll post it here on YouTube, and I'll announce it on Facebook when it hits, and you'll see it on Twitter and all the other places you can follow me. As always, thanks for stopping by. Thank you to my supporters, my subscribers, my patrons for donating to the channel. I'm humbled by your sacrifice and your contributions to the channel more than anything. And I want to give a shout out to Mr. Chip over at Discard to Reroll for an excellent episode 13 of his podcast. All his episodes are great, but this last one for me was a cut above all the others, and the subject matter was awesome and well presented. So if you want to listen to it, go over to Discard to Reroll. That's T-O, Discard T-O, Reroll to listen to it. It's a great episode. With that said, until next time, remember that not all your rolls can be perfect, so sometimes the garbage will do. And may the Force be with you.